Catherine Zeta-Jones, one of Hollywood's most luminous figures, where classical European beauty, refined elegance, and a razor-sharp acting intensity merge into an undeniable presence that has left a profound imprint on both commerce and art across decades. From the moment Elena Montero, in The Mask of Zorro, stepped onto the screen as if summoned by a pre-written destiny, the world did not merely discover a star. It encountered a commanding force so potent that every frame seemed to hold its breath before her gaze, her cadence, and her controlled ferocity. Yet that radiance was never only a story of triumph. Behind it stretched a life pulled taut between blinding spotlights and deep encroaching darkness. A marriage perpetually poised between fame and relentless scrutiny, sudden inner storms that arrived without warning, hidden health battles that forced her to stand tall even when the foundations within her had long begun to crack. Now, at 56, Catherine still faces the world with the composure of an icon. But in her eyes rests a legend wearing a crown of brilliance, too dazzling to abandon, yet too heavy to carry without pain. What had to be surrendered to become the woman the world admires, and what still whispers from the shadows, refusing to release her even today. If Catherine Zeta-Jones's journey has ever touched you, offer a hardened tribute to the woman who transformed discipline into art, endurance into beauty, and her wounds into an indomitable strength. Fame did not find Catherine Zeta-Jones first. Fate did, with the cold, unsparing blade of light. Beneath her chin rests a fine, pale scar, a slender trace that appears to vanish beneath layers of makeup and red carpet brilliance, yet in truth carries a memory more savage than any Hollywood lens that has ever circled her. Before cameras revolved around her, before an Oscar ever flashed in her grasp, she was only a small girl in Swansea, Wales, clawing for each breath as life quivered on the razor's edge of her chest. A ferocious viral infection strangled her airway into brittle, desperate threads, forcing doctors to split her throat in a merciless emergency procedure simply so she could remain in the world. The mark that remained was never mere skin. It was a brand of survival, a mute warning that her story began not in applause, but in a brutal war for air. Over the years, the scar learned to bury itself beneath elegance, beneath iron discipline, beneath the dazzling aura the world would come to worship. Yet it throbbed quietly underneath, like a heart condemned to remember its first battle. Later, Catherine would say, in a calmer, steeled voice, "People see the shine, but they do not feel the night I had to fight to keep my breath." She entered the world not on silk, but within the steady rhythm of relentless labor, born on September 25th, 1969, into a home where every dawn was met with sweat and endurance. Her father rose before the sun to keep a modest bakery alive. Her mother bent over fabric for hours, her hands toughened by necessity and repetition. Comfort was scarce, but resolve was everywhere. Narrow streets that trapped the wind, the worn clothes that carried the weight of use, and the smell of fresh bread bleeding into a cold, colorless morning. Yet even as a child, Catherine moved as though the walls around her were temporary. The family living room transformed into a stage, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, while simultaneously unlocking a future that had not yet fully revealed itself. When an unexpected 100,000-pound lottery win came, it brought no indulgence, only heavier responsibility. A move to a better neighborhood, a new pastry shop, and an all-consuming investment in her talent. Grueling dance lessons, disciplined voice training, and a stage regimen that tolerated no weakness. Her father would later reflect, "She didn't need pressure. She needed room to burn." At 4, she dominated church halls. At 11, she carried Annie on her shoulders. At 13, she ruled the West End in Bugsy Malone. But with every step toward the spotlight, childhood thinned beneath her feet. Afternoons vanished into rehearsals, innocence dissolved into expectation, and the silent rule hardened. She must not fracture. Looking back, she admitted, "While other children were learning how to play, I was learning how to survive the weight of being watched." The pressure grew up with her, quiet in presence, relentless in force. In 1983, at only 14, Catherine auditioned for the national tour of The Pajama Game, directed by Mickey Dolenz, and she did not merely win the role, she seized it with ferocity. She moved to London, throwing herself into a brutal training schedule like a true seasoned professional, and just 1 year later, at 15, they made a decision that would make many adults tremble, leaving school to pursue acting full-time. It was a courage that glittered on the surface but carved itself deep into her bones. While her peers wrote in diaries and whispered about first crushes, Catherine learned how to stand firm in rooms heavy with judgment. Looking back, she admitted without a trace of romance, "People called me fearless, but I was only running to survive. There was no second road behind me." And through it all, the scar remained, silent, immovable, impossible to erase, reminding her that her very first breath had been a battle. Catherine's childhood was molded by fate, sharpened by hardship, and carried with a grace that compelled the world's admiration. Yet beneath that admiration lay an unspoken, no ruthless truth. Greatness was never a gift placed in her hands, but a debt carved into her from her very first breath. Her childhood was not a shelter, it was a ruthless forging. Only later, much later, would people call what she achieved inevitable. What they could never see was the frozen hallway she had to walk through first, fingers numb against walls that offered her nothing, not even the promise of a door. Catherine Zeta-Jones's first encounter with cinema in 1990 did not feel like an invitation. It felt like being pushed out onto a winter sea and told to swim. Cast as a cinematic Scheherazade in the French production 101 Nights, she stepped onto the silver screen clutching a belief so thin it could have shattered in the cold. Instead of magic, she was met with a silence so vast it felt like a city turning its back at once. The film did not fail. It withered. Fewer than 740 tickets sold in France, under $254,000 earned, and sinking to 78th place at the box office. Numbers that landed like blows, clean, clinical, and utterly impersonal. It was not rejection. It was erasure. She had barely warmed her place in the frame before the industry exhaled her out of it. The dream did not explode. It splintered inward, like ice cracking beneath your feet when the wind is too loud for anyone to hear you fall. Yet she did not return home wrapped in comfort. She returned wrapped in cold, carrying a weight that felt heavier than her body, sharper than her pride. Back in England, she rebuilt not in light, but in frost, brick by brick, audition by audition, as someone who had learned that survival is often silent because hunger leaves no breath for complaint. As Mariette in The Darling Buds of May, 1991 to 1993, in warmth slowly seeped back. But it felt like a fire seen through a window, never something she could sit beside. Critics softened, audiences let her into their living rooms, yet she remained standing outside in the cold, knowing that applause is not shelter. Years later, she would recall, "I realized early that being knocked down doesn't break you. It teaches you how cold the ground can be." Her faith was not polished by comfort, it was forged in resistance, like metal left in ice. By the time she crossed the Atlantic, her resume shimmered, but Hollywood treated her like a traveler with no fixed address, allowed to visit but never to belong. To many casting rooms, she was just another beautiful British actress trying to trade television warmth for cinematic permanence. She took what opened Christopher Columbus, The Discovery, 1992, The Splitting Heirs, 1993, The Phantom, 1996. Each role looked like a step forward. Each result left her standing in the same drafty corridor, coat pulled tight, breath visible in the air of uncertainty. Reviews cooled, calls thinned, auditions ended in rooms heavy with an unspoken verdict. Not enough, not yet, not ours. Doubt clung to her like a winter she could not shed. There were nights I wondered whether stubbornness was enough, she later reflected. Nights that felt like sleeping with the lights on, afraid of what the dark might confirm. She did not grow louder. She grew steadier, harder, more unmovable, like someone who had learned to stand in the cold without flinching. She watched others rise while she remained just out of frame, still rehearsing, still moving, still refusing to disappear, as if motion itself were the only heat she could generate. Then, almost casually, the current shifted. Steven Spielberg noticed her, whether through the young Indiana Jones Chronicles or the Titanic miniseries, 1996. Hardly mattered. What mattered was that her persistence lodged in his memory like a splinter. One phone call cracked the winter. His recommendation carried her toward The Mask of Zorro, 1998, a role that demanded not glamour, but endurance. She faced formidable rivals, Penelope Cruz, Shakira, Isabella Scorupco, names already glowing in American consciousness. Catherine did not try to charm the room. She trained until her muscles trembled and her breath burned, until sweat felt like the price of warmth. Sword, horse, voice, posture, precision, refusing every shortcut that might soften her. But when the camera finally rolled, she did not merely act. She stormed the frame with a fire built from years of being left out in the cold. As one critic later wrote, she didn't steal the scene, she claimed it. The role did more than elevate her career. It thawed a dream that had once nearly frozen to death. She did not arrive grateful. She arrived forged. And in that arrival, audiences could sense, without being told, the silent hunger, the sleepless nights, the icy corridors she had crossed, the invisible toll that made her triumph feel not like luck, but like long-delayed justice. On screen, elegance appeared effortless, but it was forged through a process that quietly broke Catherine Zeta-Jones down long before grace ever reached the frame. Far from applause and visibility, she disappeared into months of sealed rehearsal rooms where glamour thinned into exhaustion and repetition, eroded comfort until nothing familiar remained. Spaces dense with sweat and silence, where no costume, no music, no encouragement softened the strain. Horses unseated her without warning. The ground meeting her before instinct could respond. Bruises spread along her ribs, dark and insistent, deepening as nights passed. Fingers split and burned beneath endless hours of sword work, steel answering each hesitation with blunt finality. Pain did not strike suddenly. It settled with patience, returning each morning heavier, more intimate, so harder to separate from thought. Still, she never asked to be spared. I understood I had to earn every moment, she would later recall, her voice stripped of bravado. Stand-ins were refused without discussion. Every blade that cut the air, every evasive turn, every flamenco-charged snap of Elena Montero's skirt carried her own balance, her own breath, her own exposure. The body audiences later admired was shaped not by spectacle, but by a decision repeated in silence, often at the edge of collapse, when no one was watching and no praise was coming. Endure or disappear. What followed was not a gradual rise, but a sudden detonation. The Mask of Zorro surged past $250 million worldwide, turning a closely guarded opportunity into a cultural force that outran control and consequence alike. The Catherine Zeta-Jones became instantly recognizable, her image saturating magazines, talk shows, and red carpets with relentless speed, admiration arriving in waves that never fully receded. She was no longer simply admired. She was installed as a standard where classical poise collided with modern force. Yet beneath the acclaim, nothing felt secure. I kept waiting for the morning it would vanish, she once admitted quietly, not from insecurity, but from memory sharpened by how swiftly fortune can shift. Momentum allowed no pause. In 1999, she moved directly into entrapment opposite Sean Connery, a film permanently etched into popular culture by a single electric image, her body threading through laser beams, precision and tension fused into something unforgettable. The surface shimmered, flawless and controlled, while beneath it, the pace tightened further, leaving no room to rest inside the image she had become, no permission to be anything other than exact. Instead of protecting the image that fame had just consecrated, Catherine Zeta-Jones turned on it without hesitation. In traffic, glamour was deliberately peeled away to expose fracture, restraint, and quiet authority, earning recognition not for beauty, but for control. And in 2002, she carried that discipline to its most unforgiving edge, stepping into Velma Kelly in Chicago while pregnant, executing relentless choreography, razor-sharp vocals, and ruthless timing without concession. The film claimed Best Picture. 10 days before giving birth, she accepted the Academy Award, one hand resting on her child, the other gripping gold beneath blinding lights. That the world framed the moment as triumph. For her, it arrived with a different gravity. I realized I wasn't just holding an award, she later reflected, her words barely above a breath. I was holding every dismissal, every doubt, every role I survived by refusing to loosen my grip. When the applause thinned and the lights softened, she stood still, alone with the weight she had carried for years, breathing through a pressure that had shaped her long before it was ever celebrated. What history preserved as victory was, for Catherine Zeta-Jones, something far more demanding and unmistakably human, a reckoning forged through endurance, and the quiet understanding that lives admired by millions are built not only on what is seen, but on what is carried, patiently, privately, and without witness. At the height of her career, when her name crowned marquees and her performances carried both fire and grace, Catherine Zeta-Jones appeared to have mastered a rare balance. Applause followed her everywhere. Success arrived with certainty. From the outside, her life seemed complete, almost protected by its own brilliance. Yet even as the world celebrated her ascent, something quieter was unfolding beneath the surface, a longing for connection untouched by spotlight, a hope that did not need an audience. It was from that place, not fame but fatigue, not glamour but yearning, that love stepped into her life. Beneath the polished lights and red carpets of Hollywood, some love stories shimmer not because they are flawless, but because they endure wounds the world never pauses to see. The connection between Catherine Zeta-Jones and Michael Douglas was unveiled as destiny. Two Oscar-winning lives divided by years and borders, drawn together as if guided by a quiet, insistent force. From a distance, it appeared enchanted, effortless, almost unreal. Yet, even at its birth, their bond was being shaped in hushed spaces where admiration brushed against solitude and hope carried a gravity it never dared to name. Catherine would later remember those early days as a fragile calm, thinking, it felt like arriving somewhere safe without knowing how long the door would stay open. The beauty was real, but so was the silence beneath it. Long before that chapter, Catherine had already learned, too early, too deeply, how love could elevate the soul and quietly erode it at the same time. Her first serious relationship, but with British television host John Leslie, began in warmth and promise, the kind that makes a young heart believe it has finally found its place. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air began to thin. Jealousy did not arrive as anger, it arrived as concern. Control did not appear as force, it appeared as care. Day by day, her laughter softened, her confidence folded inward, until her ambitions no longer felt like dreams, but disruptions, things that needed to be explained, justified, minimized. Still so young, she became aware of a frightening truth. She was disappearing inside a love that demanded closeness, but denied freedom. Leaving did not feel like victory. It felt like survival. She walked away without spectacle or blame, carrying a silent shock that stayed with her for years, what she would later describe in her own heart as, "But the moment I understood how love can gently ask you to vanish." That realization did not fade. It settled into her, reshaping how she would love forever. Then came Angus MacFadyen, the Scottish actor whose intensity reignited her hunger to believe. Their romance burned fast and fierce, filled with urgency and hope, lifting her toward an engagement that seemed to promise rest after emotional exhaustion. For a brief, dangerous moment, the future felt settled, almost merciful, as if life were offering compensation for what had been taken before. She allowed herself to imagine permanence again, to trust the shape of tomorrow. And then, just before vows could be spoken, everything collapsed. Not in anger, not in betrayal, but in silence. No explanation survived the ending. Now perhaps because no words could contain the ache of watching a future dissolve overnight. In her quietest reflections, Catherine would later think that some loves never truly finish. They simply linger, remaining unresolved, haunting the edges of memory. Those lingering loves did not leave her bitter. They left her braced, teaching her how to smile while holding pain, how to stand tall while carrying fractures unseen, and how a heart learns endurance long before it ever learns peace. Those early fractures did not harden her. They sharpened her. They taught her, quietly and painfully, that a life admired by millions often demands emotional endurance long before it ever offers peace. What lingers is not bitterness, but a deeper humanity, a hard-earned understanding that hope is never free, that belief always carries risk, and that continuing to love after loss is its own form of courage. In that endurance lies an unspoken lesson. The strength to keep one's heart open, even after it has been wounded, is not weakness. It is the rarest kind of resilience and the truest mark of a life deeply lived. Those early loves did not leave Catherine broken, but they left her alert. Each ending carried something away and left something behind. A sharper instinct, a quieter caution, a deeper understanding of how easily affection can demand more than it gives. By the time she learned to love again, she no longer stepped forward blindly. She carried memory with her, not as fear, but as weight. And it was with that accumulated knowing of passion that fades, of promises that dissolve, of selves nearly lost, that she arrived at the next turning point of her life. By the time Catherine Zeta-Jones stepped onto Europe's most prestigious film festival stage, admiration had already settled into her life like a second skin. Applause no longer surprised her. Expectation arrived before she did. At 28, yet luminous with the confidence of the Mask of Zorro, she still believed success could be carried lightly, worn, then set down. Michael Douglas entered from the opposite end of that journey, a man long shaped by acclaim and survival, twice crowned by the Academy, fully aware of how fame could expose and harden at once. When they met, the distance between them was never merely the years tabloids would later sensationalize. but the space between someone just beginning to feel the weight of being admired and someone who had already learned how permanent that weight could be. Introduced by friends, they shared an uncanny symmetry, born on the same day, yet their first conversation unsettled Catherine more than it reassured her. When Michael spoke of children and futures with calm certainty, she did not hear romance. She heard presumption. Then his words landed with a polish that betrayed familiarity, shaped by lived certainty rather than open-ended hope. Catherine responded with poise, stepping away with the calm assurance that some meetings are meant to fade. But they did not. Days later, amid the mechanical rhythm of filming in Scotland, a bouquet broke the monotony, accompanied by a handwritten note that offered neither charm nor justification, only responsibility. That restraint struck deeper than persuasion ever could. Calls followed. Then nights surrendered to voices crossing continents, bleeding quietly into dawn as they spoke not of reputation, but of parents, childhood fractures, private fears, and the slow attrition exacted by public life. In that unguarded space, Miss Catherine felt the shift. Michael stopped being a figure she had to anticipate and became a man who paid attention. On a winter night in Aspen, both unwell, wrapped in blankets instead of ceremony, he presented a vintage diamond ring. Nothing about the moment sought spectacle, yet everything about it was final. She accepted without pause. When pregnancy came soon after, joy arrived entwined with gravity, soft, anchoring, and impossible to deny. On November 2000, beneath the crystal chandeliers of New York's Plaza Hotel, Catherine Zeta-Jones stepped forward, not as a star, but as a woman carrying every lesson love had ever taught her. Draped in a custom Christian Lacroix gown, she moved toward Michael Douglas with joy that trembled gently with vulnerability, their 3-month-old son Dylan resting in her arms. And the ceremony was lavish, an estimated $1.5 million affair attended by Hollywood's most powerful names, from Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg to Jennifer Aniston and Sharon Stone. Yet beneath the grandeur lived something far more fragile, the triumph of believing again after heartbreak. That tenderness was tested almost immediately when unauthorized photographs surfaced, violating an exclusive agreement and igniting a legal battle that would stretch on for years. Though a court would later dismiss the harm as insignificant, Catherine felt the truth more sharply. Some moments, once exposed, can never be reclaimed. What should have remained sacred was absorbed by the world, leaving behind an unspoken awareness that even joy, at this height, carries consequences no contract can prevent. Motherhood quietly reshaped everything that followed. Dylan's birth, just months before the wedding, opened a new well of purpose. When Karis arrived 3 years later, that sense of meaning deepened. Longing for something untouched by flashbulbs, Catherine and Michael withdrew to Bermuda, choosing stillness over spectacle, routine over applause. For 6 years, the ocean replaced cameras, and family life took precedence over premieres. Catherine would later recall that time with a softened voice, saying it was the first stretch of her life when the word action disappeared, and she felt relief instead of loss. Yet even there, uncertainty lingered. Questions surfaced in sleepless nights about age, ambition, endurance, and whether love could survive the weight placed upon it. She would lie awake watching Michael sleep, asking herself quietly if they were enough for the life they had chosen. And each morning, she chose again, to stay, to forgive, to continue. Love isn't perfection, she once reflected. It's endurance. It's choosing, again and again. For Catherine, the truest marriage was never the one witnessed by the world, but the silent mornings that followed, where she remained present, unguarded, and human. For a girl from Swansea who once possessed nothing but her dreams, that quiet perseverance became the most meaningful victory of all. The spotlight does not simply illuminate. It presses, it watches, it waits, and when the applause fades, what remains is a cold brilliance that can bruise the soul. For Catherine Zeta-Jones, the years that followed her coronation as a Hollywood icon were not a serene aftermath, but the slow opening of a fracture inside her, invisible to the velvet rope, yet widening far beyond it. After the birth of her daughter Caris in 2003, she and Michael Douglas retreated to Bermuda, believing distance might soften the world's glare. On the surface, it was paradise, salt-kissed air, private shores, hushed mornings, but beneath that calm, her mind began to tremble. Her emotions swung like an untethered tide, plunging from crushing heaviness to restless, nameless unease. Then there were days she moved through her own home as though trapped in a performance, every step feeling like wading against an invisible current. Looking back with a clarity that still stings, she would later say, "I learned how to wear a smile for the world, while quietly coming apart beneath it." The diagnosis of bipolar II did not arrive with drama, yet it settled on her like an unshakable weight. Fear kept her silent. Fear of judgment, of headlines, of being reduced to a label. So she continued flawlessly as a mother, a wife, a star, while the woman underneath fought simply to remain present in her own body. And when she was barely still standing, fate struck once more, not as a tremor, but as a violent shift in the earth beneath her feet. In 2009, Michael's son Cameron was arrested and later sentenced for a drug-related offense, a story dissected mercilessly by the press. Catherine, already stretched to breaking, absorbed another layer of pressure, holding up her husband while shielding her children from narratives that could define them before they defined themselves. Then 2010 arrived like a thunderclap. Michael's stage 4 throat cancer diagnosis shattered their world. She came to know every corridor of the hospital by heart, the relentless beeping machines, the sterile air, the unflinching white lights that stripped everything bare. She held his hand through brutal rounds of chemotherapy, watching a man who once commanded every room shrink beneath thin blankets. The nights beside his hospital bed were unbearably long, thick, with thoughts she rarely allowed herself to finish. When a storm of media controversy erupted over Michael's comments about the cause of his illness, their fight for life was ripped from its intimacy and turned into public speculation. Later, with a restraint that somehow made it more devastating, she reflected, "It felt as if our battle to keep him alive had been turned into something people could casually consume." By 2011, her resilience had reached its limit. She entered treatment in Connecticut, not as an escape, but as a lifeline. And when the news broke, she chose to step forward herself, refusing to let silence or gossip write her story. Her voice afterward was almost surgical in its calm, yet every word carried a heat forged far beyond her own life. This is a storm that sweeps through countless people, not a secret to be buried in silence. Thousands wrote to her, and reaching through their own darkness toward the honesty she had finally claimed. Still, healing moved in jolts, detours, and sleepless nights, while doubts and whispered questions hovered over her marriage. In 2013, she and Michael did not break apart. They temporarily stepped back, a necessary breath for two people who had been holding their ground for too long. "We needed space to mend what years had quietly worn thin," she later said. A year later, they chose each other again. Without spectacle, with quiet resolve. Staying was no longer about romance, it was about endurance. Catherine emerged with deeper shadows but a steadier flame, speaking about mental health with a candor she once feared. Bipolar disorder remained, and so did she, more present than before. In refusing to disappear, she forged a legacy beyond awards. A woman who bent under pressure, fractured, rebuilt, and learned to stand in the light without pretending to be unbreakable. Because true courage is not escaping pain, it is carrying it, being shaped by it, and still moving forward. By the second decade of the new millennium, the quiet strain that had threaded through Catherine Zeta-Jones's life could no longer be smoothed away by elegance or discipline. In 2013, after years of pressure that never truly loosened its grip, she and Michael Douglas confirmed what the world had long speculated. They were living apart. The response was swift and unforgiving. Headlines hardened into verdicts. Rumors multiplied, feeding on suggestions of betrayal, dependency, collapse. Catherine offered nothing in return. No clarification, no counter-narrative, no performance for an audience hungry for spectacle. That silence came at a cost. Away from the cameras, she was unraveling. The 8 months of separation held no poetry, no softened distance shaped by time. They were raw and disorienting. At 44, she lay awake through endless nights, turning over questions she could no longer outrun, her choices, her worth, the fragile architecture of a life built piece by piece. Each morning brought the same pressure against her chest. Whether she had lost only a marriage or something far more elemental, a shared history, a sense of home, the one person who had known her without costume or applause. Friends would later recall how rarely she spoke his name, except once, barely above a whisper, as if saying it aloud might cause the ground beneath her to give way. "You don't stop loving someone simply because you're hurting," she admitted, not as resolve, but as a truth she had not chosen. And so, after 8 months, not of statements or curated healing, but of private reckoning, they reached toward one another again. No announcements followed, and no victory claimed. Only two people choosing not to disappear into separate lives when letting go might have required less courage. The ground beneath them had changed, and they learned how to walk on it. In 2017, Michael's son Cameron was released from prison and soon became a father himself. For a family long defined by fracture and judgment, the change felt tentative, almost unreal. Catherine, who had absorbed years of quiet damage without spectacle, sensed something easing. Not resolution, but the return of breath. Then, in 2018, another test arrived without warning. Old allegations against Michael resurfaced in a cultural moment sharpened for reckoning. Catherine was blindsided. Publicly, she stood beside him, composed, unflinching. Privately, those closest to her spoke of heartbreak layered with exhaustion. At 49, and she no longer had the energy to manufacture calm. "I never promised myself perfection," she reflected later, her voice pared back to its simplest truth. "I promised myself love, and love sometimes means standing still while everything shakes." The investigation dissolved without consequence, but the impact remained, settling like another quiet weight, one more stone added to a life shaped by endurance rather than ease. When the noise finally receded, what remained was not emptiness, but space. A different kind of quiet settled into Catherine Zeta-Jones's life, one that arrived not suddenly, but through small departures that changed everything. By 2020, the rhythm of the household changed again. Dylan and Karis left for college, and Catherine stepped into what she softly called their third act. At 51, she no longer measured herself by roles or applause, but by what had been endured and what was still intact. The house grew quieter, not empty. Mornings slowed, meals lingered, conversations deepened. They traveled without schedules, cooked without urgency, and spoke less about premieres and more about time, memory, and presence. A close friend later shared a small, emblematic scene. Catherine and Michael, barefoot on a wooden floor, swaying to an old jazz record as dust drifted through late afternoon light. No audience, no cameras, no performance. It wasn't impressive, the friend said. It was peaceful. In a rare reflection from that period, Catherine put it simply, "I've lived many roles: daughter, wife, mother, star. Now, I want to feel whole." For her, peace was never the absence of hardship. It was the steadiness learned within it, the choice to remain engaged, to move forward without denying what had been lived. That quiet steadiness, earned rather than bestowed, became one of the most meaningful achievements of her life. Nowadays, at the age of 56, Catherine Zeta-Jones stands not merely as a wealthy Hollywood icon, but as a woman who has quietly shaped a life of extraordinary balance, resilience, and reflection, with an estimated personal net worth of around $150 million and a combined family fortune with her husband exceeding $350 million, built through decades of disciplined work, selective artistry, and long-term investment rather than constant exposure. Her wealth is not defined by excess, but by stability and intention, spread across film earnings, producer fees, intellectual property rights, and carefully managed real estate holdings that reflect a desire for privacy and continuity more than spectacle, allowing her in this stage of life to choose projects slowly, live deliberately, and measure success not by volume, but by meaning. Her real estate portfolio remains the most visible and tangible symbol of that life philosophy, anchored primarily in the northeastern United States and Europe, where she and her family have long favored space, history, and seclusion over Hollywood glamour. For many years, the heart of her domestic life was a vast estate in Irvington, New York, a riverfront property of more than 11,000 square feet, with rolling lawns, classical architecture, and carefully restored interiors designed for family gatherings rather than public display, later sold as her children reached adulthood and the rhythms of family life evolved. In addition to New York holdings, she and her husband have owned and rotated residences in Manhattan, in Spain's Balearic region, and in Canada, and using each home seasonally, not as trophies but as places tied to memory, heritage, and rest, with interiors described by friends as elegant but restrained, filled with books, art, and personal artifacts rather than overt luxury. Beyond property, her material assets are kept notably discreet, though public appearances and verified reports indicate ownership of high-end yet practical vehicles consistent with her lifestyle, including luxury sport utility vehicles and executive sedans suited for privacy, security, and long-distance travel rather than showmanship. There is no public record of an extravagant car collection, a fact that aligns with her broader approach to wealth, where comfort and reliability outweigh display. Financial planning has been equally conservative, and while no publicly disclosed will or detailed estate document exists, multiple interviews suggest that her assets are structured with long-term family protection in mind, emphasizing inheritance planning, education security for her children, and charitable continuity rather than personal legacy. Monuments. In her daily existence now, Catherine Zeta-Jones moves with the calm precision of someone who understands both the privileges and the consequences of being admired. Her health and appearance reflect discipline rather than denial, steady movement, moderate nutrition, and emotional boundaries shaped by experience rather than trend, producing a presence that feels composed rather than preserved. Time is divided carefully between home, limited professional commitments, and a long shared domestic rhythm with Michael Douglas, The man who has stood beside her through decades marked by acclaim, illness, silence, and survival. A partnership no longer defined by headlines or red carpets, but by familiarity, patience, and the quiet negotiations of aging together. Her relationship with her two adult children, Dylan and Karis, that has matured into one of mutual respect and guidance, with public moments showing pride in their independence and education rather than control, and a deliberate effort to let them define their own paths while remaining closely connected as a family unit. Professionally, she continues to act and produce with intention rather than inertia, choosing roles in streaming series and independent films that favor maturity, complexity, and restraint over visibility for its own sake, remaining present without surrendering herself to constant exposure. What emerges now is not a declaration, but a pattern. Days lived with deliberation, choices made with care, boundaries quietly drawn and protected. Admiration may soften life in some places, yet it sharpens awareness in others, widening opportunity while subtly narrowing freedom, and offering permanence while testing the contours of identity, until presence itself becomes an act of balance rather than display. If her journey has ever led you to pause and consider what it truly means to be seen, to be admired, and to carry that admiration across an entire lifetime, we invite you to share your thoughts below, not as applause, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the human weight that exists behind brilliance, and of a life that learned, slowly and without spectacle, how to remain whole while the world continued to watch.